Welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a completely impartial but honestly fascinating look at a really complex topic. We're unpacking a source's argument that India's rigid caste divisions are actually a colonial construct, not an ancient religious one. The source dives deep into how Hindus were traditionally organized according to foundational texts like the Bhagavad Gita, the rich tradition of saints, and actual historical records, and then contrasts all of that with the colonial origins of the modern caste system. It's a completely different lens on history, so let's just jump right in. We'll trace the source material's argument chronologically today. We're going to start with the concept of qualities over birth, then look at saints and historical rulers, the colonial origins of caste, the British census system, and we'll wrap up with modern contradictions and unity.
Section 1, Gita, Qualities over Birth. Let's explore how the foundational text of Hinduism addresses societal structure according to the speaker.
The source highlights a very specific verse here, chapter 4, verse 13, to make a massive point. The argument is that originally, society was structured entirely around one's qualities and actions, not their birthline. The text explicitly states that the four categories, or varnas, were created based on guna and karma. Notice what's missing. There's literally no mention of a birth-based hierarchy here. Let's unpack those terms for a second. Guna basically refers to your inherent personal qualities, and karma refers to your deeds, or the work you actually do. So the speaker describes ancient Indian society not as some rigid hierarchy of superiors and inferiors, but actually as a superfluid, interdependent, almost guild-like system. You took up trades based on your skills, and society functioned through mutual dependence. And the source doesn't stop there. It points to other ancient texts and historical accounts that emphasize total spiritual equality. For instance, chapter 5, verse 18 of the Gita says the wise see everyone equally, from a learned scholar all the way down to an outcast. Chapter 9, verse 32 reinforces that spiritual liberation is accessible to absolutely everyone. The speaker even brings in the Greek historian Megasthenes, who visited ancient India and specifically noted the complete absence of slavery. He saw a society free from systemic birth-based oppression. Section 2, Saints and Historical Rulers. Let's move into the history of fluidity. So, the source poses a really interesting question here. If ancient society was strictly divided by birth, how do we explain the incredible diversity of these historical figures? Vedavyasa, the compiler of the Vedas, came from a fisherman community. Valmiki, who authored the epic Ramayana, came from what we'd consider a marginalized class today. Revered saints like Tukaram and Kabir, they had agricultural and weaver backgrounds. Even incredibly powerful political dynasties like the Nandas and Mauryas originated from barber and agricultural communities. The speaker argues this level of achievement would be completely impossible in a rigid birth-based caste system. To really drive this home, the source lists an extensive array of dynasties from all over the social spectrum. You've got rulers from Kahar backgrounds, massive agricultural and pastoral dynasties like the Gurjar Pratiharas, the mighty Gupta emperors from Vaishya backgrounds, and revered tribal kings from the Gond and Bhil communities who fought right alongside Rana Pratap. The point here is that this shows massive, undeniable social and political mobility throughout Indian history. The crucial point here is that this functional division wasn't just for humans, it applied to the divine too. The speaker points out that even Hindu deities were categorized by their functions, or gunas. The Ashwini Kumars, associated with medicine and service, align with the Shudra role. Kubera, managing wealth, aligns with the Vaishya role. Surya, representing power, is Kshatriya, and Prahaspati, representing knowledge, is Brahmin. The source argues this proves the entire system was about respecting all life-sustaining functions, not about inherent superiority. Section 3, Colonial Origins of Caste. Let's look at the turning point. If historical kings and saints came from all these diverse backgrounds, how did society become so fractured? Well, the source points squarely to colonial intervention. Looking at the timeline, the initial seeds were planted when the Portuguese arrived in the 1500s. But the real turning point happened much later, in 1857, during the first major Indian rebellion against British rule. After facing a truly unified Indian front, the British realized they needed to completely shift their tactics to maintain control over the subcontinent. And here's a wild fact from the explainer. The word caste itself isn't even Indian. It comes from the Portuguese term casta. This was a European concept rooted in race, bloodline, and the idea of blue-blooded superiority.
The speaker argues that applying this totally foreign, rigid concept of lineage to India was the exact catalyst that eventually corrupted the fluid, skill-based Indian guild system. Section 4. The British Census System. The Institutional Divide. This brings us to the British era, where, according to the source material, this division was systematically and legally institutionalized. The explainer outlines a deliberate three-step process. First, post-1857, the British actively sought ways to fracture Indian unity. Second, they introduced anthropological profiling. Officials like Herbert Risley literally started measuring people's physical traits. Finally, they used the census to legally categorize the population into rigid boxes based on those arbitrary profiles, effectively weaponizing social divisions for colonial control. Just look at the methods they used. According to the source, colonial officials ignored the ancient action-based system entirely. Instead, they bizarrely used physical measurements, literally charting exact nose shapes, skin color, and skull sizes to permanently separate people. They even arbitrarily divided communities into martial races, like Yadavs and Jats, and non-martial groups. The speaker highlights this to show just how unscientific and externally imposed these modern caste boxes really are. When you contrast these two structures, it's night and day. The ancient system is described as fluid, based on your deeds and highly interdependent. But the colonial system, it's rigid, legally codified, based entirely on your birth and body measurements, and essentially creates an oppressor versus oppressed narrative. The speaker argues this modern narrative was legally engineered by the British census and simply did not exist in the ancient texts. Section 5. Modern Contradictions and Unity. Let's talk about the lingering aftermath. How has this colonial legacy created illogical contradictions today? Well, notice how arbitrary the current system is. The exact same surnames are classified entirely differently depending merely on which state border you cross. A Chauhan is a scheduled caste in Haryana, but general in Rajasthan. A Gupta is an other backward class in Bihar, but general elsewhere. The speaker points out that if this hierarchy were truly an ancient, deeply rooted religious truth, it wouldn't magically change based on modern administrative state lines. To bring it right back to our daily lives, the speaker draws a really interesting parallel. They note that modern offices operate just like the ancient Guna system. Workplaces are divided by specific tasks. Some do physical labor, some do mental or administrative labor. But on a human level, everyone treats each other as fundamental equals. You'll see executives and entry-level staff chatting over coffee. The functional division does not equal human inequality, which is exactly how the ancient texts described society.
We're ending this explainer with the source's deeply provocative concluding thought. If the Bhagavad Gita preaches spiritual equality, and if historical records show massive social mobility with kings and saints from every background, then why are we still fighting over these rigid colonial boxes? The speaker asks you to critically reflect. Who truly profits from maintaining this societal disunity today? It's a powerful question that challenges us to rethink the narratives we've inherited. Thanks for joining me as we unpack this argument today. Keep questioning and keep learning.